Good evening and welcome. I know some people are still coming in, but we're going to get started. My name is Jeff Nigro. I am a research associate and coordinator of the Boschel Foundation lecture series in the arts of Greece, Rome, and Byzantium at the Art Institute. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this program by Cemal Pulak, part of the Boschel Foundation lecture series. This lecture series is generously sponsored by the Boschel Family Foundation to present programs designed to stimulate interest in the art and archaeology of the ancient world. I'm happy to say that our very good friends, Ned and Raynette Boschel, are here with us this evening, so please join me in a round of applause to thank them for making these programs possible. The Boschel lectures have been going on at the Art Institute for over 20 years at this point. Before proceeding, I want to respectfully request that you make sure that cell phones and other electronic devices are switched off or silenced. That would be most appreciated. And please refrain from taking photographs or video or audio recording of the presentation. Thank you. This lecture is kind of a part of a kind of series within the series of the Boschel lectures that we've been presenting on the thrilling discoveries of underwater archaeology. I hope some of you were able to attend a wonderful talk here last year by Deborah Carlson about the Uluburun shipwreck excavation. And this evening, it gives me great pleasure to introduce another of the great luminaries in the world of underwater archaeology. Dr. Cemal Pulak is the Frederick R. Mayer Professor of Nautical Archaeology at Texas A&M University. He received an MA and MS in mechanical engineering from Boğaziçi University, in Turkey, and an MA and PhD in anthropology, specializing in nautical archaeology from Texas A&M. Dr. Pulak has directed or co-directed the excavation of Bronze Age shipwrecks of the 14th century BCE and the 16th century BCE, a Hellenistic period shipwreck of the 4th century BCE, 8 Byzantine shipwrecks, ranging in date from the 7th to the 10th century CE, and an Ottoman shipwreck of the 16th century CE in Turkey. So we're very grateful that he's come up for air long enough to give this presentation this evening. He has served as Vice President and Director of Research in Turkey of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, which became affiliated with Texas A&M University in 1976. Among the books that he has contributed, he has made contributions to include the Maritime Studies in the Wake of the Byzantine Shipwreck at Yasyada, Turkey, published by Texas A&M in 2015, the Oxford Handbook of the Bronze Age Aegean, published by Oxford University Press in 2010, and Beyond Babylon, Art, Trade, and Diplomacy in the Second Millennium BC, the catalog to an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2008. When archaeologists from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology excavated a 14th century BCE shipwreck off the eastern shore of Uluburun, Turkey, they encountered one of the largest, most diverse assemblages of Bronze Age goods ever discovered. From elephant and hippopotamus tusks, ostrich eggshells, and logs of ebony, to gold and silver jewelry, cylinder seals, musical instruments, and even board games that belonged to the crew, their findings were rich and spectacular. You're about to hear about some of these exciting and magnificent discoveries from Dr. Cemal Pulak for his talk, Marvels of the World's Oldest Shipwreck. Welcome, Cemal.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Jeff. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us today. Well, I'll be talking about the world's oldest shipwreck that we refer to as Uluburun, which in Turkish basically means Grand Cape. And this ship sank around 1320 BC and is 3,320 years old. But before I begin, I'd like to extend a special thanks to Ned and Raynette Boschel for making this lecture series possible, but to me, more importantly, for being a member of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, board member for more than 30 years. So I've known Ned for more than 30 years, and making this shipwreck excavation possible, and also, even more importantly, the post-excavation phase of the project, which takes many, many more years than the excavation itself. So, just a little bit of a background, we're going to be taking you to the Eastern Mediterranean, an area of the very east called the Levant that includes part of Greece, Turkey, Cyprus, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Egypt. And we're going to be talking about a ship that sank on the very southwestern coast of Turkey at a place called Uluburun. This is the name of the Grand Cape, and it's in the ancient part of Turkey called Lycia. Now, just a little bit of a background information here with regard to the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is actually one of the most exciting and illustrious period of the ancient world. This is when societies progressed from the Stone Age to the Age of Metals, metallurgy. Complex metallurgy developed, resulting in the development of strong and durable agricultural tools that led to agricultural surpluses. It resulted in the production of new types of weapons, stronger weapons, and heralded new discoveries and inventions in warfare. This is a time when there were great interconnected relationships between ancient kingdoms and regions, and at a time when polities and societies established their palatial politics that depended on long-distance trade as well as relations. So this is a very important part of the ancient part of human history, and we're going to be looking at a ship that sank exactly during this time, toward the end of the Bronze Age period, in the late Bronze Age period, along with all sorts of wealth that was acquired from the then-known ancient part of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the ship was almost certainly bound for a destination in Greece, probably up here. The major powers be of this period in Greece were the Mycenaeans, the name that we give to Bronze Age Greeks, and in most of modern-day Turkey, we have the Hittites, both Indo-European speaking peoples, and along here, we have a series of city-states of Canaanite origin or Semitic people, and then, of course, the other major power in the region is Egypt, to the south. So this ship actually started its voyage somewhere, we believe, in an area that corresponds to northern Israel today, and was heading northward along this coast, as many ships of the period do, and then they turned westward along the southern coast of Turkey, where a number of shipwrecks have also been found of this period and partially excavated, on its way to Greece. For some unknown reason, the ship met its demise at the Grand Cape, or the Grand Point called Uluburun, in Turkey, at this location here that I've marked. Now, this area is also now referred to as Kaş. You may have seen that name before. That's because it's the name of the modern town which Uluburun is a part of. The ship was trying to round the cape, and here you can see a view of the Grand Cape looking from south to north, and the ship came to rest after hitting the rocks here on its eastern slope, obviously unable to round the cape and continue onto its voyage to Greece. And here is an artist's depiction, a lot of artistic license there with regard to what the ship looks like. We know it didn't look anything like that, but you know, it makes a nice picture. So it rounded the cape, and here you can see sailors obviously under some difficulty taking depth measurements because they are fearing of impending danger. The site itself was quite deep, even though it's so close to the shore. But here, the landscape underwater continues pretty much as we see on the land here. So it gets very deep quickly, and the shipwreck would have been located here. Our research vessel, the old research vessel, was moored semi-permanently directly over the site so that the divers could dive directly from the shipwreck down to the site without wasting any time underwater, because diving at that depth is quite limited. So the excavation lasted for 11 consecutive summers. It's the longest and deepest excavated shipwreck known. And yes, it's been nearly 30 years since we completed the excavation, but every summer for 3 months of the year, I am in Turkey still working on this material. Now, you know what I mean by the post-excavation work, which takes a lot longer than the excavation itself, because all the artifacts have to be conserved, cleaned, restored, mended, studied, documented for final publication. The site was is actually on a fairly steep slope, ranging in depth between 40 to 61 meters. That's roughly between 131 to 200 feet deep. And over the 11 consecutive seasons of 3 months each, we compiled more than 22,000 working dives. Actually, the dives are even more than that, about 25,000, because we have to have acclimation dives, etc. But of those 25,000 dives, 22,500 were for the excavation and recording of the site underwater. So this graphic gives you an idea of the continuation of the slope on the seabed, which is about 35 to 40 degrees at places. And the ship hit the rocky promontory, turned around 180 degrees, slid down the slope until it became lodged in this gully with rocks on one side and a huge rock crab on the opposite side, with a list or tilt to starboard at about 15 degrees. So over time, as the ship hull began to disintegrate and the hull collapsed, the artifacts spilled down the slope all the way down to here to 200 feet. It probably goes down even deeper. That's way beyond the safe diving limits using air. In fact, the safe diving limits start right where the shipwreck begins. Had this ship sat on a nice flat seabed, our lives would have been much more simplified, but because all the cargo spilled down the slope, breaking up as it did so, makes it very, very difficult to assemble all the thousands, 10,000s. Actually, we recorded 25,000 objects from the site that we've assembled into intact artifacts over the years. So here is what our site plan looks like, color-coded based on the types of artifacts found, and we're going to look at them a bit more closely in the coming slides. The green represents the ship's primary cargo or main cargo of copper ingots. The orange represents the pottery found on board the ship. The purple or lavender is tin ingots that were found on board the ship, and the deep blue, etc., are glass ingots. And you can see the rock outcrop here. The ship became wedged right in there, and the reconstruction of the ship with the cargo placed inside the hold of the vessel before it sank is shown to your right. So as I mentioned, the ship's primary cargo was 10 tons of copper ingots that were stacked in 4 rows. Let me just go back here. You can see, I'm at here. Row 1, row 2, row 3, and row 4. And these were actually stacked one on top of each other, these ingots. Initially, we thought they were stacked like a deck of cards, but as the excavation progressed and we documented each of these ingots with regard to their location and depth, and we found out that wasn't really the case. The ancients really knew what they were doing, because you can see here in the cross-section of one of these ingot rows, they started placing the first ingot on the port side of the ship, the red one here, and then the next one partially overlying the first one, the third partially overlying the second, all the way across the ship. And then they started the second row in the opposite direction in an overlapping manner here in a herringbone pattern. And this is quite deliberate, because one of the most dangerous things that can happen to a ship when it encounters foul or rough weather is the shifting of cargo. And this prevented the cargo from shifting, and but unfortunately, for some other reason, the ship sank regardless. Now, it might not seem all that exciting or interesting with regard to the ship's primary cargo, but you got to remember this is the Bronze Age. And bronze, as you know, is an alloy of copper and tin in a ratio of about 10:1. So here we have 10 tons of copper ingots in the form of 354 ingots of the type that we refer to as the oxhide shape. These are called oxide ingots because it was thought at one time that they were cast in the likeness of dried ox skins, and that each ingot's metal value was equal to that of a live oxen, but we've shown that not to be the case based on the differing sizes as well as weights. And another 121 pieces of these circular ingots that are commonly referred to as bun ingots. So we have more than 10 tons of such ingots on board the ship. These are strategic materials of the period, just like oil is today coming from the east heading west. So one of the most important things to be able to determine on shipwreck excavations, especially with regard to their cargo, is where was this material coming and where it was going. Where it was coming from is a bit easier to establish, although it requires a lot of interdisciplinary studies with various scientists from around the world, and its final destination we can only surmise based on what we find on the ship. So with regard to the copper ingots, using lead isotope analysis, I won't go into it, but basically lead occurs in everything, even in the air that we breathe here as an impurity, and by looking at the various ratios of lead isotopes in various materials, and in this instance copper, we can get a geological age, and comparing that geological age with deposits in the Mediterranean, one can establish a source for it. And it turns out on the Uluburun shipwreck, all the copper, both the oxide ingots and the bun ingots, are originating from an area right here on Cyprus. But perhaps the most important find on the Uluburun shipwreck is the occurrence of tin. Tin, as you know, is the other component for making bronze, and usually in a ratio of 10:1. And until the discovery of tin ingots on the Uluburun shipwreck, not a single piece of tin ingots had been found from the entirety of the Bronze Age, which is about 2,000 years past the history of man's past. And suddenly, we have a ton of tin ingots on board the Uluburun shipwreck. Not only do we have perfectly preserved tin ingots in the metallic form, but also we were able to determine that they were, some of them were cast in the likenesses of the copper oxide ingots as well. Now, tin does not occur in the Mediterranean, so it's all being imported into the Mediterranean to sustain a new era, the Bronze Age there. So with the alloying of the 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of tin, we have 11 tons of bronze, which is sufficient to equip an entire army with weapons, armors, and helmets, etc. And here you can see from a near contemporary Egyptian tomb painting of various porters, Syrians, and Aegeans carrying various goods, including copper oxide ingots here that we know from the color because it's orange, but there are other instances where they're carrying ingots that are gray colored, and we now know them to represent tin. So therefore, we talk about the Bronze Age, we still don't know where the origin of tin is. Copper is easy because when we started excavating this wreck, various archaeologists and metallurgists had scoured the Mediterranean and established a database for the origin of copper that we could compare them to. But tin, since it doesn't occur in the Mediterranean, we had to start all over. So by using lead isotope analysis, tin isotope analysis, trace element analysis, we are now pretty certain that the tin on the Uluburun shipwreck did not come directly from a single primary source, as did the copper ingots from Cyprus, but rather came from different areas, and then for some reason, they ended up in the southwest eastern part of Turkey in the mountainous region where even in earlier times there was some tin, and then they were cast into ingots to be sent southward, then put on board the ship to be sent westward. So some of the areas where this tin came from that we recently determined is Central Asia, the Tian Shan Mountains and the Altai Mountains of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan up here, Afghanistan, and we seem to have some tin from the Taurus Mountains as well. And some of this tin may, in fact, have also been alloyed with tin coming from Europe, from England. But it's very difficult to distinguish between them because they've been amalgamated into one tin ingot. Another first for the period was the discovery of these large cakes of glass, about 5 pounds apiece. We weren't quite sure what they were initially, but now we know. These are man's or humankind's earliest attempts at making simulated materials, and these are glass ingots made to look like various semi-precious, or back then they were precious, stones of the period. The most common were the ones that were colored in cobalt blue, and in fact they have a lot of cobalt in it, which gives them this deep blue, or made to look like lapis lazuli, the stone, which at that time came only from Afghanistan. Additionally, we had ingots that are light blue in color, probably to represent turquoise, and even a few that were purple color, perhaps emulating amethyst, and one not shown there that is deep yellow, perhaps meant to be amber. We've analyzed all these, and chemically, we now think that they were coming from Egypt from a yet undiscovered Egyptian workshop, and then later, once we assembled all the thousands of pieces of sherds into complete vessels, we ended up with one piece here, which really confounded me. So one day I put it under the microscope and realized that it had molten glass on it. So it turned out basically that this was a part of the crucible or the mold in which molten glass was, melted in to be made into ingots. And therefore, here you can see similar examples, and here's an Uluburun glass fitting into it, from Egypt. And the clay analysis did indicate, in fact, that this crucible was made from silt from the Nile River. So we determined that its origin was Egypt. So you can see all these things coming from different parts of the ancient world, all ending up on a single ship. Another raw material that was first for the Bronze Age was not these two-handled pottery containers that we call amphoras, but what they contained. There were different sizes of these amphoras. We roughly broke them down into small, medium, large, and extra large. And you can see how we restored them occurring in the ship's stern area, with the smallest in the middle, but stacked in 2 layers, and then the largest just forward of that, sort of preventing, laid out as a barrier to keep the smaller amphoras from falling forward into the hold. About 60% of our amphoras, there were 150 of them to be precise, were a one type, this small type that I just pointed out here, and you can see them under restoration here, and they all turned out to carry some sort of a resin. It took us a long while in collaborating with all sorts of scientists to determine what that resin was made of. And since this is an art museum, I'm happy to say that the people who've actually figured it out were the scientists at the National Gallery in London, where they deal with paints and varnishes and all sorts of things. And they were able to determine, came up with a methodology to identify it as a type of resin that was obtained from a species of a tree like that of the same family as the pistachio. So this is basically terebinth resin. We never knew that terebinth resin was an important commodity in Egypt, but now we know, because what's now established, that the Egyptians called this word here, which, believe me, is supposed to be pronounced snetcher. And we can see a warehouse here of a governor showing all sorts of materials found on the Uluburun ship, like the copper ingots, some eggshells that we're going to be looking at, ostrich eggshells, and various amphoras filled with various contents, some of which you can still read the label, and one says snetcher. And now the methodology has been developed, so they've been able to identify the use of this resin now as incense in great quantities by the Egyptians, as a protective varnish for paints and wall paintings and tombs, and even hermetically sealing Egyptian coffins that were used that contained mummies, as well as a wine preservative. And you can see some of the resin here. Now, obviously, the resin, after being underwater for more than 3,300 years, most of it disintegrated. But if the amphores were all filled with resin, that would have been more than half a ton, or 600 kilograms of resin being carried on board the ship, which elevates now this resin to a major Bronze Age commodity that we had no idea of before. Now, how do you determine the origin of resin? There is no chemical analysis that have been developed. So this is why it's helpful to take a lot of courses when in college. And so being interested in zoology and ethnobotany, zooarchaeology, I took a number of courses. And during the excavation, I realized that there were these snails that were being found both inside the jars as well as outside them that were not sea snails. They were terrestrial snails. So we started collecting those. And at the end of the excavation, we ended up with a lot of these snails, wondering what to do with them. But if you do your homework and search far and wide, you will always find a person somewhere in the world involved with the most esoteric part of your research. And suddenly I did find one in Germany, and he came to the site and examined these and collected samples from the Uluburun region to make sure that they were not intrusive. And he determined that among the snails, there were two species that were endemic, rather meaning that they were found in very limited areas. And those we've plotted on this map here. So we have inside the jars, the resin jars, along with the resin, these two snails which must have been introduced to the jars, along with the resin, that are represented by the red stars here and the black dots here. And since we found both species inside these jars, the resin must have come from an area where both of these endemic species overlapped, which, as you can see, is the northwestern and the southwestern side of the Dead Sea in Israel. And the resin would have been obtained from these large terebinth trees by harvesting, scouring the surface of the trees. We have also 50 pilgrim flasks. These are called pilgrim flasks because they look like the flasks that were used in medieval times when pilgrims were visiting the Holy Land. And we've determined that they carried some sort of a special vegetable oil, but unfortunately it had degraded to the point where it could not be fully identified. But basically, great numbers, different sizes, carried large quantity of this special oil. In addition to these raw materials, we have exotic raw materials that would have been used only for a palace or the elite at the destination port of the ship. Among them, we have a squared off section of an elephant tusk that you see here, and hippopotamus teeth. Altogether, we have 14 of them. And in fact, you can see from the near contemporaneous painting from the tomb of Rek-Murray, again, Syrian porters carrying oxide ingots of copper, elephant tusks, and even live animals. Here's a bear, and here is a juvenile or baby elephant. And note that he's got tusks. Well, we know from the nature documentary series that baby elephants don't have tusks. So this craftsman really had no idea what he was drawing, and having seen these in real life, he thought because they're small, they must have come from baby elephants. And here we see another porter carrying something like a baseball bat. Well, we have those on board the ship as well. They are ebony logs. Ebony comes from equatorial Africa, so it went up perhaps the Nile or the Red Sea and ended up on the ship being sent westward. The Egyptians, you may not know it, but the Egyptian word for ebony is hebony. It's what the Egyptians called ebony, but unfortunately the true ebony, or the ebony of the Egyptians, is called something else today. That's African blackwood. But you can see a number of Nubian porters carrying not only elephant tusks and animal pelts, etc., but logs of ebony that we found on board the ship. We found about 24 of them, but certainly there were more. They must have floated off or eaten or consumed by marine organisms after the ship sank. We found also ostrich eggshells. These were blown, so they would have been used for their shell only. There were not foodstuffs on board the ship. One of them even survived intact. And we thought this would be an ideal material that would have been imported into the elite palaces of the Aegean Sea in Greece and Crete, because upon reaching there, they would have been made into ornate ceremonial vessels by adding mouths and spouts and bases, etc. But we did find this one piece of glass here, and that was very surprising because it does seem to fit the curvature of one of the eggs. So does that mean these were not just raw materials, eggs, but rather they were made vases being exported? And if so, that would be the first of such an incident. Manufactured goods were also carried on board the ship. Among the large objects, pottery objects, were these large, very large store jars, known as pithoi. And you can see all the marine growth on it. It doesn't even look like a large jar. And in fact, on my first dive at 150 feet, I was narcosed, and I thought it was a very nicely, conveniently placed boulder that I could ply the marker buoy on the ship. And on later dives, it became apparent that it was not a boulder, but rather a storage jar. So as the excavation progressed, we had to move this jar out of the way. And here you can see we're using a lifting bag to aid its lifting and tilting it, and we're collecting all the sediment inside it for later sieving to understand or get an idea as to what the jar was carrying. And actually, for this jar, we didn't need to do that because all that spilled out of it was this pottery. This is pristine, unused pottery made on the island of Cyprus. So basically, at least 3 of these 9 jars were being used like the Bronze Age equivalent of modern-day china barrels. These potteries, some of them, these were found still stacked one inside the other, inside that large storage jar. And here we can see oil lamps. That turned out to be quite interesting because here you can see oil lamps still stacked one inside the other. We have more than 3 dozen of these, and none show any sign of use. The oil lamps would have been used by placing oil inside it and then a wick, and when lit, one would get oil soot here, a darkening or charring. None of the 3 dozen Cypriot oil lamps showed any evidence of charring, but 2 dozen other types of oil lamps found on board the ship. Note here, we've analyzed it, and this is made on the mainland in northern Israel and not on Cyprus, and more than half of them show evidence of use. So that's important because this is not a trade item. This one is a trade item, but this is not because it's for shipboard use. And it showed that those on board this vessel actually preferred to use these Canaanite or Bronze Age Semite oil lamps rather than the Cypriot ones that were found mostly inside those large storage jars. The ship also carried jewelry. Yes, some of them may have been personal possessions of the ship's elite merchants, but we know that they also carried beads as a cargo, because here you can see a broken amphora filled with thousands of glass beads. We estimated that if it were full, it probably had about 60,000 glass beads in there. But other beads include rock crystal, faience, it's like glass, a stone, ostrich eggshell, agate, etc. These finds are among my favorite. We found 28 seashell rings. They are made from a species of mollusk called a cone shell, but they do not occur, this species does not occur in the Mediterranean, and it must have come from the Indian Ocean or the Red Sea. And on the exterior is a groove, and inside the groove is this black material, which is natural asphalt called bitumen. And that was used as an adhesive to affix small bits of shaped glass, none of which survived. Here's the best surviving example. But we were able to determine by the impression left behind in the bitumen by these small pieces that these are the patterns and the colors likely were represented in these rings. Now, just to give you an idea, these seemingly simple seashell rings, what it took to make them. Obviously, shells would have come from the Indian Ocean, either through the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. If it came through the Persian Gulf, it would have gone through the Euphrates River basin to a place called Hit, which is in central Iraq. And today, it's still seeps of asphalt that is used by the locals. And that's we were able to identify chemically that the bitumen or the natural asphalt outside the rings actually came from this particular seepage. And then the rings must have progressed onto the coast, either glass made in Mesopotamia or the Egyptian glass went up there and they were cut into pieces and then made into these rings, being exported westward. Until recently, these were unique, but now only one example has been found in a major port city here called Ugarit from the tomb of a wealthy noble lady. So what to make of all this? Yes, we've determined the origin of the raw materials, but you can't really determine who was behind that trade and where it was going based on the cargo of raw materials and manufactured goods that the ship was carrying. So here you can see I'm sort of confused underwater looking at all these things, wondering what is going on from where, because here you can see copper oxide ingot from Cyprus. Here you see a Canaanite amphora filled with terebinth resin from the Levant. Here is a special drinking cup from the Mycenaean world, the Aegean. Here's a pilgrim flask, and here's a tooth of a hippopotamus, weights, etc., and a nice gold chalice that we found. Now, we're very happy we found gold because we thought they would tell us a lot, but I like to say that to this day, we still haven't found a good comparanda or a parallel for this. We don't know what it means. So basically, for the nautical archaeologists, the only nice thing about gold is that it survives well and it doesn't need conservation. So this is one of the largest gold objects that have been found from the ancient Bronze Age of the Canaanite world. You can see it's more than 10 ounces. And it might represent what we refer to as the international style representing tastes and flavors of two different worlds, both the Aegean and the Levant. Now so basically then we said to be able to determine the nationality or the ethnicity or the home port of the vessel and those on board, we have to separate the cargo from personal possessions. And therefore, we started looking at items that were not cargo. And to be able to determine that, of course, you need to excavate the ship in its entirety and determine what can be cargo and what is cargo, as opposed to what were shipboard items, as well as personal possessions. So we found a lot of these Egyptian objects, some of which actually appear to have been made in Cyprus, and others probably not in Egypt because they have fake hieroglyphs on them, which don't mean anything. But the most remarkable, shown largest here, but actually it's the smallest one of the lot, but I have to show it as large, is a gold scarab naming Queen Nefertiti. The beautiful one has come, Nefer, Neferuaten, Nefertiti. This is the only gold scarab of Nefertiti to have been found anywhere, including Egypt. And somehow, as you know, Nefertiti and Akhenaten, after their death, were pronounced heretics, and anything and everything having to do with them was destroyed by priests. For some reason, this little scarab made it on board the ship, and its destiny was that we find it 3,320 years later. So the other personal effects include a lot of scrap jewelry. You got to remember this is a time before coinage was invented, at least 600 years, 700 years earlier. So for small buying and purchasing along the way, they would have used precious metals and they would have cut them to smaller sizes as needed. Here, for example, is a typical gold ingot. Bits of it have been cut off, as you can see here. Silver bars, parts of which have been cut off, and many of them are just scrap pieces of gold jewelry. So all those scrap pieces of gold and silver jewelry of Near Eastern origin, again, Canaanite. But perhaps the most telling was the nature of the weights for weighing on board the ship. This was my doctoral study looking at Bronze Age weights and weighing systems in the Levant as well as on shipwrecks. And I was able to determine that there were 4 sets of these weights found on board the ship, and they all conform to the same mass standard. So if you have a merchant ship, and therefore this is a pre-coinage society, everything precious has to be weighed with these weights for a balance scale. And in fact, here we can see an Egyptian tomb painting showing in a warehouse weighing valuables such as pectorals, and here you can see gold ingots like the one I just showed previously on our ship, and they're using weights in the form of animal shapes like these to weigh them. That's an equal arm balance. And we also have one of the largest collections of bronze zoomorphic or animal-shaped weights that you can see here. It's not the entire assemblage, but here's a lion, a lioness, a sphinx, bulls, calves. Here's a frog, water birds, and the smallest one not shown here is in the shape of a housefly. This is my favorite. Unfortunately, it's not well preserved because this was cast hollow in bronze, and the cavity was filled with lead to make it heavy, but lead and bronze corrode at different rates, so it's damaged. But it's a nice, beautiful bucolic scene of a herdsman kneeling with one hand on his knee and the other palm down, looking at his 3 newborn calves, of which only 2 survive. So all of those are, again, Canaanite or Near Eastern in origin, as is the sword that we have here, along with 3 similar daggers. You can see that they still retain their ivory and ebony inlaid hilts. So these are items of great value and would have been carried by the ship's head merchant along with 3 other merchants. So everything points to the number 4. So we may have had 4 merchants on board the ship, one of which was the head merchant. These merchants would have also carried cylinder seals. They were made of various materials. They would have been rolled on wet clay, leaving an impression behind, indicating ownership of the individuals that rolled them. We also have a number of jewelry. We didn't know what to make of them. Were these gifts? Were these items worn by the merchants or crew? But we do have a very nice collection of gold jewelry, one of the largest, in fact, found from a single site. Many of them show Egyptianizing characteristics, such as this falcon that we see here with outstretched wings, and you can see 2 hooded cobras clenched in each foot. So these are basically large medallions. Some are smaller. We have different pendants with very simply inscribed depictions on them. But these 3 actually were found together. Here we have one in the form of a medallion, one in the form of a crescent or a moon, and then one in the form of a pear-shaped pendant representing a nude female. Now, a temple hoard from the city of Uluburun, which is in northern Syria that I mentioned a little while earlier as having been the only place where such a similar ring, seashell ring to the one that we found at Uluburun was found. And in that temple hoard, there was an altar in the temple, and when that altar was removed, they found underneath the altar a hoard of gold jewelry, which consisted of a nude female goddess, 6-rayed and 4-rayed stars. Here's 4-rayed, the previous slide had 6 rays, and then 2 crescents. Well, we know from texts from the same area at Ugarit, they talk about their gods and goddesses. They talk about Astartes, goddess of love and warfare and fertility. They talk about suns or god Shapash, they're the suns, and they talk about moons. So basically, this is not a simple collection of jewelry carried for personal adornment, but they were carrying on board the ship representations of their important gods and goddesses. And this would have been perhaps the ship's protective deity. She may have cast in bronze. She may have been completely clad in gold, but much of it has been lost. And we know it's a god because the gesture of the arms, one clenched fist and one palm facing down, is one of benediction. When we first found it, here's what it looked like, and I thought this is going to be a smiting god. And then upon cleaning, it turned out not to be the case. So this might be another version of a protective deity in the form of Astarte. Ivory containers in the form of ducks that have wings that are hinged. And when they are opened up, you can reveal a cavity inside where offerings would have been placed. Obviously, these would have been used for shipboard rituals because it's not an ideal item to have on board the ship for everyday usage. They are unstable. Ivory doesn't survive well in high humidity conditions. So these would have been used in rituals along with other fancy containers made out of boxwood, most of which were lost due to disintegration. And then we found these ceremonial cups that are referred to as raita. They would have been used in raita in plural or raiton singular. They would have been used in rituals such as a pouring of wine, libation, or drinking ceremonies. And you can see that you can't set them down. They don't have a base. So we found 4 of them, 3 of which you see here. This is the best preserved one, and all 4 of them are in the form of a ram's head. And then we found 1 chalice in the form of a woman's head. You can barely make out her features here. She wears a conical cap, her hair, her eyes, and then she would have a neck and a base. So that's the only one that could stand. And on land examples, where they are found in temples, you usually find a single female chalice and 1 or multiple animal heads that are usually in the form of male animals. So I suspect that these were, again, used for libation and fertility ceremonies on board the ship after conducting or concluding a successful merchant venture. So here's one of my favorite Egyptian tomb paintings. Unfortunately, the entrance to this has collapsed, so no one's seen it for 100 years, but basically showing a Canaanite merchant venture arriving in Egypt from the tomb of Khenamun. You can see it's roughly about 100 years earlier than the dating of the Uluburun shipwreck. And here you can see several ships, a fleet of ships, which may have been the case for our ship. Our ship may have been one in a fleet, we don't know. But here you can see they're approaching land. We have a person up in the crow's nest shouting out, "Land is visible." Well, you can see a bird here as well. It's one of the things that seamen look for to when approaching land. And then everybody scurrying up on the top to see land. And on board the ship, I number them, we have 4 merchants. Is that a coincidence? And one of them is painted the largest. Egyptians paint more important individuals larger than the others. So this must have been the head merchant. And what is he doing? He has a libation cup in hand. Could that be like a ram's head? And in the other one, he has a chalice, like the gold chalice. And you can see a little cone there with a bent top. Well, that's an Egyptian symbol of burning incense. And we have another merchant uncorking or uncapping one of the amphoras, perhaps to pour wine into the libation vessel. So basically, this is a scene of ceremony, ritualistic ceremony, taking on board the ship in thanks to gods for the successful voyage. So basically, we've established that the ship is a Canaanite ship carrying all sorts of goods from the Near East to the west to Greece. But what about these Mycenaean objects that we are finding on board the ship, these Bronze Age Greek objects? We seem to have them in pairs. We have a pair of drinking sets. We have a pair of swords. And most of the other weapons and everything else on board the ship is in multiples of 2. So it appears to me that these were not merchants because there are no weights, the tools of trade, but these are very high warrior class emissaries that were on board the ship, escorting the ship back to their homeland, perhaps for a safe voyage in the Aegean area where there are many islands and a lot of pirates. So all these questions perhaps could have been answered had the writing surface, which would have been beeswax, survived on the world's oldest notebook. You can see these are called writing tablets. They're 2 pages, and the 2 pages are hinged together with a 3-piece ivory hinge, the centerpiece of which is missing. And you can see that the recess here would have held a beeswax writing surface. But sadly, the beeswax has completely disintegrated, so we don't know what it says. But it is interesting that in all of Homer, in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, there is only one instance of the mention of literacy, and that's in the Iliad, Book 6, line 169, where he says, he sent to Lycia. Remember, Lycia is the place, the name of the ancient place where the ship was found, the Uluburun shipwreck was found. He sent to Lycia and gave him baneful signs in a folding wooden tablet. So perhaps these, we have a part of a second one here. So perhaps these may have been bill of ladings on board the ship, indicating what was being sent to whom and what was expected in return. We've also learned a little about the ship, the kind of ship that the Bronze Age Semites used, the Canaanites used. Not much of the ship was preserved, but still the red area here in the reconstructed size of the ship shows what was preserved. We've learned a lot about the way Bronze Age seafarers traversing most of the eastern Mediterranean, even to the west beyond, sailed on. They would have been actually the earlier precursor of the types that we know from our shipwreck excavations of the Greek and Roman period, whereby the ship was built shell first or plank by plank first, and then some ribs or framing was added for reinforcement as needed. But when you build a vessel shell first or plank by plank, since there is no internal rib work attached to planking to, you have to fasten the planks to one another using a series of edge joinery. In this instance, this type of edge joinery, the schematic you can see here, is what we refer to as mortise and tenon joinery. Basically, mortises are cut on the two faces of the planks to be joined, and then into the cavity is placed a wooden tongue called a tenon, and once the two planks are joined together, a hole is drilled through the mortise and tenon joint on either side of the plank seam, and pegs are driven into it to lock them in place. And it's exactly what we see here. I've highlighted the pegs with these white dots. So with this minimal remains, we've taken back Bronze Age shipwreck building by several thousand, a good thousand years. And ironically, even though the hull itself was not well preserved, we have evidence for the preservation of parts of a ship that would have been way above the deck. The weather fencing, here you can see the uprights of the weather fencing and the fencing itself. And this also is interesting because in the Odyssey, in Homer's Odyssey, in Book 5, when Odysseus is leaving the island of Calypso, he builds a boat, and then one of the last things he does is he fenced in the whole from stem to stern with willow withies to be a defense against the waves. So basically, as we can see in the Tomb of Khnum painting, that the Canaanite ships were made seaworthy by adding these weather fencings. And the ship carried anchors. This is the first time we're finding a full complement of anchors associated with a Bronze Age shipwreck. As you can see, these are very different than the anchors that we know today. These are called weight anchors because they hold the ship by their sheer weight alone. And as you can see, that would not be very effective, so they carried many of them. And they often lost a lot because of frayed lines, etc. But we found 24 of them, 16 of which were located at the bow of the ship ready for deployment, and then they were carrying another 8 amidships as spares to replace the ones that were lost along the way. And they varied in size from about 265 pounds to 460 pounds apiece. So basically, what we have here in summation is a vessel that's about 50 feet in length, and based on this reconstruction that we made, it could carry about 30 tons, of which we could account for about 20 tons. So there might have been additional cargo, such as ebony logs, such as textiles, perishable cargo, that just did not simply survive into our time, and we can only guess at. So the ship originated, or they began its voyage, in this area right here, in the northern part, very northern part of Israel, taking on all sorts of goods from tin from Central Asia and perhaps also Europe, ebony logs from equatorial Africa, glass from Egypt, elephant ivory perhaps from northern Africa or Syria, hippopotamus teeth from here, Cypriot pottery, and copper ingots, which probably were transshipped into a warehouse on the mainland before they were put on board the ship, and the ship sailed northward, and upon reaching the Anatolian Peninsula, sailed westward, and then sank right here. Had it not sunk, it probably would have continued on to mainland Greece, perhaps to Mycenae, the largest Mycenaean or Bronze Age Greek city, and then after taking on reciprocal cargo, it may have completed its counterclockwise voyage via the north coast of Africa. So basically then, what are we dealing with? Was this a royal shipment? Based on the amount of goods, the variety of goods, and its wealth, it seems highly likely. But it could have been also a shipment of palatial and elite mercantile partnership. We just can't say for sure, but perhaps if the wax had survived, we would have a better idea. Or was it simply a non-royal elite entrepreneurial undertaking? I put them in the order of possibilities, but I think the most likely are the first two that we show here. And with that, thank you very much. I conclude my presentation.